The call started on a Tuesday, but by Friday night the entire neighborhood had stopped pretending it was a coincidence. Every evening, just as the old church clock struck exactly 9 p.m., a golden retriever named Rusty would quietly cross Maple Street, stop in front of the same weathered blue house, and sit perfectly still beneath the porch light until sunrise. He never barked. He never scratched the door. He never chased passing cars or wandered into nearby yards. He simply stared at the dark second-floor window as though someone inside was silently waiting for him. Families walking their dogs began crossing the street to avoid him. Children whispered that he was guarding a ghost. Even the mail carrier admitted he hurried past the house every morning without looking up. The strangest part was that nobody in town claimed Rusty belonged there. His collar was clean, his coat was brushed, and someone was clearly feeding him. Yet every morning, just before the first school bus rolled through the neighborhood, he disappeared without leaving a single clue about where he lived. Margaret Collins, who had lived across the street for nearly 20 years, watched the ritual from behind her kitchen curtains every single night. At first she assumed the dog had lost an owner, but the weeks kept passing, and Rusty never cried, never searched, never acted confused. Whatever had drawn him to that porch seemed deliberate. One evening she walked across the street carrying a bowl of fresh water and softly called to him. Rusty briefly turned his head toward her, accepted a single gentle pat on the shoulder, then calmly faced the upstairs window again as if nothing else in the world mattered. The expression in his eyes unsettled her more than any growl could have. It wasn't fear. It wasn't loneliness. It looked like patient determination. Soon more neighbors began gathering on their porches every night, watching from a distance as though they were waiting for something invisible to happen. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed the dog had been trained by someone. Others insisted he was warning the neighborhood about danger no one else could see. Yet every sunrise arrived, peacefully, leaving only more unanswered questions. After 17 separate non-emergency calls from concerned residents, Officer Daniel Brooks finally received instructions from the station to document the situation himself. He expected to find a harmless stray attracting unnecessary attention. Instead, when he parked his cruiser across from the blue house shortly before 9, Rusty appeared from the darkness with uncanny precision, walked straight past the patrol car without hesitation, sat beneath the porch light exactly where every witness had described, and fixed his eyes on the silent upstairs window. Daniel checked his watch, then looked back at the motionless dog. Before he could step out of the cruiser, every light inside the house suddenly flickered once, and Rusty quietly stood up for the very first time. Rusty remained standing beneath the porch light, but instead of moving toward the house, he lowered his head and slowly backed away until he reached the edge of the sidewalk. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his cruiser, expecting the dog to run, yet Rusty simply watched him with quiet, exhausted eyes before returning his attention to the second-floor window. There was no panic in the dog's posture, no aggression, and no sign that he wanted anyone to leave. If anything, it felt as though he wanted someone else to notice what he had been noticing every night. Daniel crouched a few feet away and spoke softly, but Rusty did not react to his voice. The dog seemed completely focused on something beyond human understanding. Margaret Collins eventually crossed the street carrying an old quilt because the temperature had dropped into the low 40s. She carefully spread it across the dry section of the porch, hoping Rusty would lie down and stay warm. He acknowledged her kindness with a slow wag of his tail, stepped onto the blanket for only a brief moment, then quietly returned to the exact patch of concrete where he had been sitting every night. It was almost as if he believed leaving that spot, even by a few feet, would cause him to miss something important. Daniel noticed another detail that made his concern grow. Rusty looked healthy, but not rested. Dark circles surrounded his gentle eyes, and every few minutes he released a long, weary breath without taking his eyes off the upstairs window. This was not the behavior of a frightened stray or a confused pet. It looked more like the determination of someone carrying a responsibility that had lasted far too long. Curious, Daniel checked recent reports from nearby animal shelters and veterinary clinics. Nobody had listed a missing golden retriever matching Rusty's description. His microchip registration was current, but the emergency contact number repeatedly went straight to voicemail. Whoever cared for him had seemingly vanished from his daily life without officially disappearing. Night after night, Rusty continued the same lonely routine while the rest of the neighborhood gradually resumed normal life around him. Children no longer laughed when they passed the blue house. They waved quietly instead. Delivery drivers left extra biscuits near the porch. Even people who had once complained about the mysterious dog now found themselves checking through their windows each evening to make sure he had arrived safely. Without anyone realizing it, Rusty had become part of the neighborhood's heartbeat, and yet nobody truly knew why. Shortly before midnight, Daniel decided to leave his patrol car parked across the street and observe from a distance. Hours passed with almost complete silence except for distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. Rusty never once closed his eyes. Then, just before 2 o'clock in the morning, the dog suddenly tilted his head as though he had heard something too faint for human ears. His ears lifted, his breathing slowed, and for the first time all night his gaze shifted away from the upstairs window toward an old, rusted mailbox near the end of the walkway. Daniel followed the movement, expecting to see nothing at all, but even from across the street, he realized the small red mailbox door was swinging gently back and forth, despite the air being perfectly still. Officer Daniel Brooks walked across the quiet lawn and gently pushed the loose mailbox door closed, expecting the faint metallic tapping to stop. It did, but only for a moment. Rusty remained perfectly still until Daniel stepped away. Then, almost as if responding to an invisible signal, the dog rose, crossed the yard without hesitation, and nudged the mailbox door open again with remarkable precision before returning to his usual place beneath the porch light. Daniel frowned. It was not random. Rusty had deliberately reopened it. Curious neighbors who had gathered behind their windows watched in silence as Daniel repeated the experiment twice more. Each time the officer closed the mailbox, Rusty patiently waited, walked over, nudged it open, and quietly resumed his watch. No barking, no excitement, no reward, just the same strange routine. The following evening Daniel arrived earlier, determined to observe without interfering. Rusty appeared at exactly the same time, but this night his behavior shifted in a way no one had seen before. Instead of sitting immediately, he paced a slow circle around the front walkway exactly 3 times before stopping near the porch steps. He lowered his nose to one specific wooden plank, touched it lightly with the tip of his paw, then backed away as though crossing an invisible boundary he refused to break. Margaret noticed the unusual movement and whispered that the dog had never done that before. Daniel carefully inspected the porch, yet everything appeared ordinary. The boards were old but solid. The flower pots were undisturbed. There were no unusual scents, sounds, or signs of recent activity. Rusty watched Daniel's inspection without moving a muscle. When Daniel finally stepped off the porch, the dog quietly returned to the exact plank, tapped it once more with his paw, and resumed staring toward the second-floor window. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood, and speculation grew even wilder. Some residents became convinced the dog had developed obsessive behavior. Others worried he might suddenly become unpredictable after spending so many nights alone outside the same house. Parents began telling their children not to approach him, even though Rusty had never shown the slightest hint of aggression. Animal control received several concerned calls suggesting the dog should be removed before something happened. Daniel resisted those requests because every instinct told him Rusty was trying to communicate rather than intimidate anyone. Still, he could not explain why every unusual action seemed so carefully repeated, almost like a silent routine that could not be interrupted. Shortly after midnight, a light rain drifted across Maple Street, soaking the sidewalks and washing away every footprint on the concrete. Rusty remained outside without seeking shelter. When the rain finally stopped, Daniel noticed something astonishing. Instead of returning directly to his familiar spot, Rusty slowly walked backward all the way from the mailbox to the porch, never once taking his eyes off the upstairs window. The movement was awkward, deliberate, and unlike anything Daniel had ever seen a dog do. Reaching the porch steps, Rusty stopped, lifted one front paw into the air, and held it there without making a sound. Seconds later, the upstairs curtain moved just enough to reveal that someone, or something, had briefly shifted behind the glass before everything became completely still again. Officer Daniel Brooks could not stop thinking about the faint movement behind the upstairs curtain. But before he could request permission to inspect the property, the situation shifted in an unexpected direction. By the next afternoon, several residents had filed formal complaints insisting that Rusty was frightening families simply by returning night after night. Nobody accused him of attacking anyone because he never had, yet his quiet routine had become something people could no longer explain, and what they could not explain, they slowly began to fear. Parents chose different walking routes after sunset. Real estate rumors spread through the neighborhood, with some claiming potential buyers had already turned away after hearing stories about the mysterious dog outside the blue house. Margaret tried to defend him, reminding everyone that Rusty had never barked at a child, chased another dog, or damaged a single piece of property, but her words were drowned out by growing anxiety. To many neighbors, the issue was no longer Rusty's behavior. It was the uncomfortable feeling he created simply by refusing to leave. Daniel sensed the conversation slipping away from facts and toward assumptions. He contacted the county records office hoping to learn more about the house, but administrative delays meant he would have to wait until the following day. Time was running short. That evening, an animal control officer named Rebecca Lawson arrived after receiving repeated requests from concerned residents. She approached Rusty carefully with a leash in one hand and a calm voice, explaining that he would only be taken to the local shelter until someone identified his owner. Daniel quietly objected, arguing that the dog appeared healthy and might be trying to communicate something important. But Rebecca reminded him that public concern had reached the point where officials were expected to act. Rusty looked toward her as she approached. Instead of retreating, he calmly stepped aside from his usual spot, almost as though he understood every word being spoken. For a brief moment, Daniel believed the dog would willingly leave. Then Rusty slowly turned, walked back to the porch, and gently placed one paw on the same weathered plank he had touched the night before. He lowered his head, closed his eyes for only a second, and looked once more toward the silent second-floor window. The gesture was so deliberate that even Rebecca hesitated. Margaret wiped away tears she did not expect to shed for a dog she had only known from across the street. Daniel felt an uncomfortable weight settle in his chest because nothing about Rusty's behavior resembled panic or stubbornness. It resembled duty. Nevertheless, procedure could not be ignored forever. Rebecca clipped the leash onto Rusty's collar with practiced care, while Daniel made one final phone call asking the records office to hurry. The answer was the same. Nothing would be available until morning. Rebecca nodded sympathetically, opened the transport vehicle, and quietly announced that if no new information appeared within the next few minutes, Rusty would be driven away before another night began. Rebecca Lawson paused with one hand resting on the transport vehicle door, waiting for Rusty to climb inside. The dog surprised everyone again. He did not resist, pull away, or attempt to return to the porch. Instead, he calmly walked toward the vehicle, then stopped beside it, and looked past everyone toward the front steps of the blue house one last time. Daniel followed the direction almost automatically, wondering what the dog could possibly be trying to show them before leaving forever. The porch looked exactly as it always had, except for one detail so ordinary that nobody had noticed it during the previous several nights. A small brass wind chime hanging near the entrance was moving in a slow, uneven rhythm. Daniel instinctively glanced toward the maple trees lining the street, expecting a breeze, but their leaves remained completely still. Curious, Margaret stepped onto her own porch and pointed toward the American flag across the street. It hung motionless against the pole. Nothing else in the neighborhood was moving. Yet the brass tubes beside the blue front door continued making the faintest, irregular taps, stopping for several seconds before gently shifting again. Daniel crossed the yard and examined the chime more closely. It was old and slightly tarnished, with one wooden striker worn smooth from years of use. There was nothing unusual about its condition. He reached out and steadied it with one hand. The soft metallic tapping immediately stopped. A few seconds later, after he released it and stepped back, the chime remained perfectly still. Rusty quietly lowered his head as though waiting. Nearly half a minute passed before the smallest movement returned, just enough for the striker to touch one brass tube with a delicate click. Daniel frowned. The pattern was inconsistent, but it was not completely random. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket and began marking the intervals almost without thinking. Margaret watched silently until she noticed something else. Every time the sound returned, Rusty's ears lifted slightly before anyone else seemed to notice it. The dog was not reacting to the chime itself. He appeared to be anticipating it. Rebecca, who had spent years handling frightened and abandoned animals, slowly unclipped the leash from Rusty's collar. She quietly admitted she had never seen a dog remain so composed while facing removal from the only place he insisted on protecting. Daniel compared his notes one more time, then looked at the front porch again. The tapping did not follow the wind, passing traffic, or nearby footsteps. It seemed connected to something inside the house, something subtle enough that everyone had dismissed it as coincidence. For the first time since the strange reports began, Daniel felt he was no longer chasing an unexplained behavior. He was following evidence. He thanked Rebecca for giving him a few more minutes and asked Margaret whether she remembered the last time anyone had actually spoken with the owner of the blue house. She hesitated much longer than expected before quietly admitting she could not remember seeing anyone enter or leave the property for several weeks. Daniel slowly closed his notebook, looked once at Rusty, then reached for his radio and requested immediate authorization to conduct a far more thorough welfare investigation of the house before anyone moved the dog anywhere. Authorization arrived less than 5 minutes later. Officer Daniel Brooks and Rebecca Lawson approached the front door together while Margaret remained on the sidewalk with Rusty, who unexpectedly refused to follow them. Instead, the golden retriever quietly walked to the weathered porch plank one final time and rested his paw exactly where he always had. Daniel knocked several times and announced himself, but only silence answered. After receiving clearance for a welfare entry, he carefully unlocked the door with assistance from emergency responders. The house was remarkably tidy. Family photographs covered the hallway walls, fresh groceries still sat inside the refrigerator, and a half-finished crossword puzzle rested on a small table beside a reading chair. Nothing suggested abandonment. Yet the entire home felt strangely paused, as though someone had intended to return only moments later. Daniel slowly searched each room, while Rebecca listened carefully for any sound. Upstairs, they found an empty bedroom with curtains partially drawn, matching the very window Rusty had watched every night. It looked untouched except for a neatly made bed and a small calendar with every date since 3 weeks earlier left unmarked. As Daniel continued through the hallway, he heard the faint metallic tapping again. It was the exact rhythm he had recorded outside. This time he realized it was not coming from the porch. The sound traveled through the wall itself. He stopped, pressed his hand against the hallway floor, and felt the slightest vibration beneath his boots. Rebecca noticed a narrow closet tucked beneath the staircase. Inside were shelves of blankets, cleaning supplies, and an old wooden panel that appeared newer than everything around it. When Daniel carefully moved the shelves aside, he discovered a concealed utility access leading into a compact maintenance space built beneath the stairs. The tapping immediately became clearer. Shining his flashlight inside, he found an elderly homeowner sitting on the floor, weak but conscious, wrapped in blankets with a flashlight, bottled water, and a walking cane beside him. During a recent electrical outage, the heavy access panel had shifted shut behind him, leaving him unable to push it open from the inside. To conserve energy, he had tapped a nearby water pipe with the metal handle of his cane at regular intervals whenever he heard quiet outside, hoping someone might eventually notice. The sound traveled through the house, gently vibrating the porch structure and causing the brass wind chime to move just enough to create the faint clicks Rusty always anticipated. The dog had not been staring at an empty window or guarding a forgotten house. He had learned the hidden rhythm of the trapped man's signal and returned every night because he refused to abandon someone who was still waiting to be found. The upstairs curtain had moved only because warm air from the concealed utility shaft occasionally drifted through the old ventilation system. As emergency responders carefully helped the exhausted homeowner into the fresh night air, Rusty calmly stepped forward, gently touched the man's hand with his nose, and quietly sat beside him without making a sound. Daniel looked at the faithful dog, then at the neighbors gathering across the street, and the weight of every complaint, every rumor, and every misunderstanding settled over the crowd at once. No one spoke. They simply stood there, realizing the one soul they had nearly removed had been the only one who truly understood that someone inside the house had never stopped asking for help. Rusty did not rush toward the ambulance or seek attention from the growing crowd. He remained beside the elderly homeowner with the same quiet patience that had defined every night outside the blue house, as though the only thing that mattered was seeing the man safely back among people again. The silence that settled over Maple Street felt heavier than any apology could have been. Daniel Brooks slowly looked around at the neighbors gathered along the sidewalks and recognized the same expressions on every face. They were not simply embarrassed. They were replaying every assumption they had made over the past 3 weeks. Every whispered rumor, every nervous glance through a window, every complaint filed against the dog suddenly sounded painfully small compared to what Rusty had been carrying alone. Margaret remembered the evening she had wondered whether the dog had become obsessed with an empty house. Now she realized he had never been waiting for an empty house at all. He had been waiting for someone to hear what everyone else had ignored. Rebecca Lawson quietly removed the transport crate from her vehicle without unfolding it. She stared at it for several seconds before closing the rear doors again. The shelter that had almost become Rusty's destination was no longer needed. Instead, she walked over, knelt beside him, and gently unclipped the leash she had fastened earlier. Rusty barely acknowledged the gesture. His eyes never drifted far from the homeowner, who managed a tired smile before slowly reaching out with trembling fingers. The old man rested his hand on Rusty's head, and the dog finally released a deep breath that sounded as though it had been trapped inside him for weeks. Daniel suddenly understood why Rusty had never barked, never scratched the door, and never chased after passing strangers. Noise would not have changed anything. The dog had chosen persistence over panic because somewhere along the way he had learned that the faint tapping inside the house was the only clue anyone had left to follow. One by one, neighbors crossed the street carrying small gestures instead of empty words. Someone placed a fresh bowl of water near the porch. Another brought a soft blanket that actually stayed beneath Rusty this time, because he no longer felt compelled to guard the exact spot every second. Children who had once been told to avoid him quietly sat on the curb several yards away, watching with wide eyes as their parents explained that courage sometimes looked surprisingly ordinary. No speeches were given. No dramatic excuses were offered. The neighborhood simply began correcting its mistake through quiet actions. Daniel contacted dispatch and requested that every complaint associated with Rusty's behavior be formally updated with the outcome of the welfare investigation so the official record would forever tell the complete story. Rebecca volunteered to arrange a full veterinary examination at no cost, not because anyone believed Rusty was ill, but because someone who had protected another life so faithfully deserved the same care in return. As emergency responders prepared to leave, Rusty finally stood beside the homeowner without looking back at the porch for the first time since anyone could remember. Daniel watched the loyal dog take that single peaceful step away from the house, and in that moment, every person on Maple Street silently promised themselves that they would never again mistake quiet devotion for something that needed to be feared. Over the next several days, Maple Street changed in quiet ways that no town meeting could have planned. Nobody wanted Rusty to carry his burden alone ever again. Instead of treating the faithful dog like a mystery, the neighbors began treating him like someone who had protected one of their own. Margaret organized a simple rotation so someone would always stop by the Blue House each morning, not because Rusty needed guarding anymore, but because the elderly homeowner would need friendly faces while recovering. Daniel Brooks personally visited after every shift, sometimes bringing nothing more than fresh coffee for the homeowner and a tennis ball that Rusty rarely chased, but always carried gently back to the porch before setting it down beside the old man. Rebecca Lawson kept her promise and arranged a complete veterinary examination. The results brought smiles instead of concern. Rusty was healthy, only exhausted after weeks of quietly keeping watch. The veterinarian suggested plenty of rest, good meals, and familiar surroundings. For the first time since the strange events had begun, everyone understood that the greatest medicine Rusty needed was peace. The neighborhood decided to give him exactly that. A local carpenter volunteered to repair the aging porch, but before replacing the weathered plank where Rusty had rested his paw night after night, he carefully removed it and polished the wood instead of throwing it away. He mounted the plank onto a simple stand beside the front garden with a small brass plate that read, "The place where loyalty waited." It was not a monument to mystery. It was a reminder that quiet acts of devotion often go unnoticed until someone finally pays attention. Children walking home from school began stopping there to leave handwritten notes and small dog treats. None of them climbed on the display or turned it into an attraction. Somehow they all seemed to understand that respect was the greatest gift they could offer. Weeks later, the elderly homeowner regained enough strength to spend his afternoons sitting on the rebuilt porch with a blanket across his knees and a book in his lap. Rusty no longer faced the second-floor window or listened for hidden tapping inside the walls. Instead, he stretched comfortably across the porch boards with his eyes half closed, waking only when he heard the familiar sound of the old man's gentle laughter. Daniel noticed another change that touched him more deeply than anything else. Every evening, almost exactly at 9 o'clock, Rusty still walked to the front edge of the yard. For a brief moment, he paused in the same place where his lonely vigil had once begun. Then, instead of standing guard, he calmly turned around and walked back toward the porch without hesitation. It was as though he was quietly confirming that the house no longer needed protecting before allowing himself to rest. Margaret smiled every time she witnessed the little ritual because it no longer carried worry. It carried peace. One cool autumn evening, as the porch light glowed softly against the fading sky, the homeowner reached down and absent-mindedly scratched behind Rusty's ears while continuing to read his book. Rusty slowly closed his eyes, let out the deepest, most contented sigh anyone had ever heard from him, and for the very first time since he had arrived on Maple Street, he drifted into a calm, unbroken sleep without listening for another signal, because at last he knew someone else was watching too. As winter slowly gave way to spring, life on Maple Street settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and quietly transformed. The blue house was no longer the place people hurried past with uncertain glances. It became the house where neighbors stopped to wave, where children slowed their bicycles to greet an old man reading on the porch, and where Rusty could usually be found stretched comfortably in a patch of afternoon sunshine. Visitors occasionally asked about the polished wooden plank displayed beside the front walk. Instead of telling a dramatic story, the neighbors would simply smile and invite them to look around. They would notice the repaired porch, the healthy garden, the brass wind chime gently swaying whenever a real breeze passed through, and the golden retriever resting peacefully with one ear always tuned toward the quiet voice of the man he had refused to abandon. The homeowner often said that people believed Rusty had saved his life, but he preferred to describe it differently. He would explain that the dog had protected something even more fragile than a heartbeat. He had protected hope. Every evening, when the neighborhood lights flickered on, families found themselves paying closer attention to small things they once ignored. An unanswered knock, an elderly neighbor who had not collected the morning newspaper, a porch light that stayed on longer than usual. Children who heard the story grew up remembering that paying attention was sometimes the greatest kindness a person could offer. Daniel Brooks carried the lesson into every call he answered afterward. Whenever another officer dismissed an unusual complaint as probably nothing, Daniel would quietly remember the patient dog who had never stopped returning to the same place simply because someone still needed him. Rebecca Lawson began sharing Rusty's story with new volunteers at the shelter, reminding them that behavior always tells a story, even when people do not yet understand the language. Margaret kept fresh flowers beside the polished plank throughout every season, replacing them before they faded because she believed gratitude deserved regular care instead of occasional remembrance. Rusty never became interested in fame, photographs, or the attention that followed. If someone praised him, he usually accepted a gentle scratch behind the ears before wandering back to the porch where the old man sat waiting with another chapter of his book. That quiet routine became the happiest ending anyone could have imagined because it required nothing extraordinary anymore. There were no more mysteries to solve, no more lonely vigils, and no more silent signals hidden beneath old walls. There was only trust, restored one ordinary day at a time. Years later, newcomers to the neighborhood sometimes asked why everyone smiled whenever they saw the golden retriever resting beside the porch. The answer was never written on the plaque or spoken in exactly the same words. It lived in the way every neighbor looked a little longer, listened a little closer, and chose compassion before judgment. Sometimes the loudest call for help is the one that never makes a sound.